Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. More crazy stuff to talk about today. So we're continuing our unit here on challenges to American ideals. We're going to start talking about in the next couple lessons Native Americans in the United States. And that's what we're going to start talking about today is the treatment of Native Americans by the official United States government the first 100 years that the government exists. All right, wild stuff to talk about. Let's go ahead and get started. So the 1700s and the early 1800s Native American interactions. It is worth noting here, by this point, the Native Americans are clearly a minority. Smallpox ravaged the Native American communities when Europeans had showed up. Usually accidental, sometimes used as a weapon. That's U.S. history conversations that kind of out of the scope of this course. However, they are the minority. They're going to struggle to fight back against the United States by the time the United States exists and becomes the United States. Two key concepts that we will talk about here as we talk about Native Americans over the next couple lessons are going to be assimilation and reservations. So what a reservation is an area of land set aside for Native Americans. Sometimes that's a good thing. If Native Americans chose their own land and that got to be a reservation, may be happy with it. If they were forced onto a reservation they didn't want or an area of land they didn't want, it's a horrible experience. So reservation isn't necessarily good or bad. It depends on the situation. Typically, again, not a lot of feel-good stories here with the treatment of this group of people. And assimilation, this is always talked about, assimilation. Americans back, we want Native Americans to assimilate into American society. We can say that. What Americans really mean when they say they want Native Americans to assimilate into American society is they want Native Americans to be white. Assimilation means merging two cultures. But America doesn't really want to learn or adapt anything from Native American experience or their culture. So it is very clear that it is a idea that assimilation is only they want Native Americans to be white. If Native Americans are resistant to that, oh well. All right? And it falls into these other concepts we talk about in U.S. history at the time with manifest destiny. But the main thing that the Native Americans had that America wants is land. As the American country grows, you're encroaching on Native American lands that have lived there forever. One of the most egregious examples of this is the Treaty of Greenville, which is in Ohio. All right. So all the area in pink here on this map is area that is owned or lived on by Native Americans, and they've had it for thousands of years. America wants it. So sometimes the history book will say, and they went and they signed the Treaty of Greenville, and the Indians moved, and Americans got this land. And the promise is the Treaty of Greenville, anything to the left side of this map, you can have forever. All right? Just going out there, you're good. Just have this river here be our dividing line. All right? Well, the books are always like, oh, they signed it and they moved on. Well, it wasn't really like that. It would be the military shows up with guns who are more powerful than the individual native tribes and say, sign this or we're going to shoot you and take it. So Native Americans had to sign these contracts giving land to the United States government. And this is in large part by the 1800s how the land got taken from the Native Americans and continued to push them off their land. So even though it looks like they chose to give them the land, it was usually pretty aggressive. Native Americans from the beginning, because they'd already had tension before America became America, not a big truster of the United States government, but they don't have a choice here. So the question here is to explain why Native Americans chose to give their lands to the United States. Chose is in quotes for a reason. So explain basically how we have these contracts where Native Americans appear to be just giving their lands to the United States. Explain how that's taking place. All right, pause me, we're moving on. Oh, we're gonna jump right into some awfulness. This thing called the Indian Removal Act. So we're in the 1830s now. So we have a president, a guy named Andrew Jackson. All right, this is him here on the left. He's He's one of the people, really war hero of 1812. He's from the South. A lot of adjectives you can use with Andrew Jackson, but without going down that rabbit hole. Andrew Jackson is very stubborn. He's going to get what he wants, period. He is loved by the American people because he's like kind of a hardcore redneck, so I joke around. Not necessarily. He is obviously a very intelligent man, very stubborn. He is also like one of the people. He is not an aristocrat. He's a war hero in 1812. He is not college educated and super fluffy. Not that he's not smart. He's just like country. All right, like he's one of the people identify with him. Like, yeah, that's my boy right there, Andrew Jackson. So when he comes into office, he's always having to battle with people who didn't like what he was doing, but because the American people loved him, he could get away with a lot of stuff. One of the things that he does that was even controversial at the time, but he did a lot of things that were controversial at the time, all right? But he got away with it because the American people supported him, all right? Because the people loved him, the rest of the government didn't trust him, but this is like one of the first presidents we've had that's not a founding father. I say all that because this is crazy in modern day, all right? And you're like, I can't believe people weren't like horrified by this. There were a lot of people that were horrified by this, but he was used to just ignoring other people's outrages. Here's what happens. America is expanding and getting larger populations, especially down into Georgia. You can see on this map here that the dark green areas, these are places where Indian tribes such as the Cherokee and the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw Indians, they lived in these regions. However, now Americans want to live here. White Americans want to live here, and the Indians, they're in our way. Like, that was it. There wasn't even going to be like a treaty of Greenville. So the United States government goes to these people, all right, and say, you need to leave. And the Indians are like, no, we're not going to. So they pass a law, Andrew Jackson here passes a law called the Indian Removal Act, forcing Native Americans to leave their lands and go out to what is present day Oklahoma. Passes a law. But the Indians are like, no. By this point, the Indians realize, like, there's like a second Black Hawk War. There's some other little skirmishes that happen, but they get annihilated trying to fight militarily against the United States. So the Native Americans have gotten smarter. They know how this works. They sue the state of Georgia, and then it will go up to the Supreme Court in the court case Worcester versus Georgia. Basically, the Indians sue the United States government and say, no, you can't kick us off the land. We were here first. Squatters' rights was a thing. If these were Americans, you couldn't have kicked them off. And but they're technically not citizens yet. That's, spoiler alert, 1927 is when Native Americans become citizens. When this is being recorded right now in 2021, it still has not been 100 years, has not even been a century since Native Americans have been citizens of the United States, and they've been here for thousands of years. Anyway. Georgia says, or the Supreme Court agrees once this gets appealed to the Supreme Court, you're right, Native Americans. You don't have to leave. You're right. That law is unjust. Throwing it out. John Marshall, all right, the head Supreme Court justice that was there during Marbury v. Madison, still there because this is in the 1830s. He's been there for a while. He basically rules the Indians don't have to leave, and that Jackson's wrong. He can't do this. Okay, so not a thing. One of the wildest responses by a president ever is Andrew Jackson's response to hearing that the Supreme Court told the Indians they didn't have to move. He responds with, John Marshall made his decision. John Marshall's the Supreme Court justice. Now let's see him enforce it. Basically, oh, I can't do something? How many guns you got? None? Because I have a lot of guns. So you can't stop me? All right, we're doing it anyway. Even though the Supreme Court said you cannot do this, and it's wrong, illegal to do this, Andrew Jackson does it himself, or does it anyway. It is worth noting, Andrew Jackson absolutely to blame here. His next president, Martin Van Buren, a guy you've probably never heard of, actually carried this out. So Martin Van Buren, just as culpable as Andrew Jackson. This spans 2 different presidencies of them forcing the Native Americans, and the yellow lines are where they forced them to. They're going to force them out of their lands they've had for thousands of years across the country. They're going to make them walk for like 1,000 miles. It is absolutely insane for months and months and months. No breaks. Now, they're able to sleep at night, but you didn't get like multiple days to rest up like on the weekends. You had to walk every single day. So if you got hurt, rolled an ankle, couldn't walk 30 miles a day, or however many miles they were making a day, if you couldn't do that, they would just leave you and you would die. 1 in 4 of the Native Americans forced here will die, and the United States government doesn't care. It's called the Trail of Tears, where the Native Americans are forced off their land into Oklahoma. We understood what marching does to people. We knew what this would do to not let them rest, and we did it anyway. It wasn't a surprise that 1 out of 4 Native Americans died. We weren't even upset as a country. The general idea was less. Cool. It's hard to comprehend now. When Native Americans, or when African Americans were fighting for their rights, there was a whole movement of people that were not African Americans, white people that supported that movement, the abolitionist movement, even before slavery ended, led by white people because slaves were slaves. You don't have a big Native American movement in the United States. It was non-existent. So people that would stand up to slavery, people that stood up to negative treatment of immigrants or to women, they're not standing up for the Native Americans. So that's on us as a society. There just wasn't people that stood up and defended Native Americans en masse. So the question here is, what was the motivation for the Indian Removal Act? Why do we want them to move? And it's such an awful reason. It was just, they wanted land for white settlers to live in. That was it. All of that was over just white. It's crazy. Anyway, pause me, answer that completely, and we're going to move on. So we continuously, with the Treaty of Greenville, with the Indian Removal Act, we have continued to push Native Americans west. All right. Well, eventually America is going to start moving west, and it's going to cause more issues. All right. Because while the Indians are getting pushed out there, a lot of them die off because there's a whole different way of life, and their entire society kind of starts dwindling out. The Native Americans that lived out in the middle of the country, the Plains Indians that hunted the buffalo, lived in teepees because they traveled every day to follow the buffalo. They see what happens when the Americans show up. And they're not big supporters of America. All right? So they've been left alone for a long time until 1848. In 1848, in this piece of land that we had just gotten from Mexico called California, they discover gold in California in 1848. And there is a mass movement of Americans from the East Coast sprinting across the center of the country to get to the West Coast in order to find gold. So once Americans start trying to flood into California, all of a sudden tensions with Native Americans skyrocket once again. And the reason is because if you're going from the East Coast to the West Coast, there's no trains at the time. There's no water route to go all the way around unless you're going to go all the way around South America. There's no planes. You're getting on a wagon and you're cutting across the center of America. So when the Americans are going over here, they're looking at a map like this. And they're like, oh, well, look at all that wide open, unorganized territory. We're just going to cut right through, take whatever we need on our way over there, because it would take months and months and months, all right? As we're cutting across the center of the country, what they're not realizing is this isn't just empty territory. This is territory heavily populated with Native Americans. All the red areas are areas where Native Americans have lived for a very long time. The Native Americans in the middle of the country, also very different from the Native Americans that are living on the East Coast. The Native Americans that America is used to dealing with. typically the Native Americans on the East Coast are at least somewhat agriculturally inclined, where they grow stuff. When you grow stuff, you're in a stationary position, and because you're stationary, you typically have to work with your neighbors because your crops are there and you can't just leave. The Indians in the middle of the country, mainly the Sioux Indians, which is spelled S-I-O-U-X, right? Even though it's pronounced Sioux, very different. The Sioux Indians and any of the Great Plains Indians here in the center of the country, they typically don't grow food. They get all of their food from the buffalo. All right. This is why these Native Americans, they live in teepees. They just pack up very quickly. You can travel, you can follow these massive herds of buffalo. So they're also seeing what has happened to the other Native Americans and are much more willing to fight back than the Native Americans that were on the East Coast that were willing to strike deals. So as the Americans come across through Indian land, messing with possibly their food supply, which is the buffalo, there is immediate tensions between the Native Americans in the middle of the country and the settlers coming across, and there starts to be conflicts very quickly as Americans travel through Native American land. Now, with this picture, this has to either be like Photoshop or a stick. No way buffalo are that dumb to come that close to teepees unless they're trying to be breakfast. Anyway, I just want to show you this picture. There's no way this is an actual accurate picture. Well, it wouldn't have been colored photos anyway. Moving on. So the question here is, why were the Native Americans out west concerned with the amount of settlers cutting through their land? And we talked about that from a couple different angles right there. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right, the Sioux Indians. So let me get right here. So these trails are where most of the settlers are traveling. Well, it'll cut right through some Indian territories, and there are battles. And Native Americans will kill the settlers. Settlers will kill Native Americans. Absolutely, Native Americans will sneak attack at settlers. They're just passing through and murder them in the middle of the night. That absolutely happened. And there's tensions because they've seen what has happened historically between the two people. So it's not everybody's a victim or everybody's a victim at the same time or nobody's a victim. It's not simple to say good guy and bad guy here, other than the fact that there is a ton of tension immediately between the Great Plains Indians and the settlers because they've seen what has happened to Native American land. The United States, this isn't really states at the time, it's just kind of unorganized territory. So they kind of let the military take the lead on how to deal with this, all right, with Native Americans attacking settlers and vice versa. So the military comes up with this idea, all right, called the Treaty of Fort Laramie, all right. So Fort Laramie is a fort, and it's where this treaty comes up at, where basically the military meets with a lot of the tribal leaders and says, all right, tell you what, we know there's been some murdering going on, some crazy stuff. How about we make a deal? We will make sure settlers stay pretty much on their path as long as y'all don't try to murder them. Most Indian chiefs signed this, right? However, the Sioux area, and you can see here on the map that Fort Laramie is at the bottom of this, and that the trail here in the Sioux territory, which is this yellow area, which kind of touches Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska today. It's a huge area. This trail is basically, goes right next to, if not through their land. And Sitting Bull, who is the head of the Sioux Indians at the time, says, no, I'm not going to sign it. If they come in our territory, we're going to murder them. We're not going to go look for them, but they come in our territory, we're going to murder them. Sitting Bull did not play, all right? Now, all of this territory right here, all right, if you're like, oh, it looks in the middle of the country, I don't know what's there. This territory, which we'll reference the Black Hills here, and again, this is Sitting Bull. Here's the Black Hills today. You've seen it, you just are not aware of it. It is where present-day Mount Rushmore is carved in, is in what is the Black Hills, which is in South Dakota, all right? But Sitting Bull was not going to sign another treaty with the United States because he didn't trust them, all right? And also doesn't know why he needs to sign a treaty if they've already said they weren't going to come onto his land. So he's like, I'm not signing a treaty. As long as they don't come to our land, we ain't going to go looking for them. All right? We're not going to their homes and attacking them. That's happening here. If it happens here and they come on our land, we will defend ourselves. So the question is, explain why Sitting Bull refused to sign the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Answer that completely, and we'll move on. So the whole deal was, we'll stay off your land. We're heading over here to California. And Sitting Bull says, as long as you stay off my land, we ain't going to have any problem here in the middle of the country. Well, this worked out well until gold, and everybody's freaking out about gold at the time, is found in the Black Hills. Oh, like 5 people showed up in the middle of their land and started looking for gold. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Wagstaff? No. These are boomtown. Immediately, people flood into Sitting Bull's area looking for gold. He'd already said, stay away from here, and they find gold in his area. They didn't have any need for gold. They hunt the buffalo. Well, you can imagine tensions rise pretty quickly here, all right? Sitting Bull, all right, and this is a photograph of Sitting Bull. It's probably more of a wax figure made of him. Anyway, this is Sitting Bull on the left. They start attacking these settlers here in the Black Hills. Well, you now have Native Americans attacking settlers. The military tried to be nice, and the Americans might try to be nice with the Treaty of Fort Laramie. So now Sitting Bull and his men have to be taught a lesson. All right? This is the mentality of America. We got to go in and kill Sitting Bull. That's the American mentality to this response to Sitting Bull attacking people in the Black Hills because they are there for gold. Enter General Custer. So General Custer is the guy in the area that is going to be tasked with taking out the Sioux Indians and Sitting Bull. He is told immediately, hey, General Custer, we got to send you some reinforcements. I know you got like 100 men here, but there's a lot of Sioux Indians there. So wait until you get reinforcements before you go try to, teach them a lesson. This is where your ignorant racism comes in. Custer's like, they're Indians. What could they possibly do to me? I want to go in and kick them in the face. I don't need reinforcements. And General Custer and his men roll in to fight Sitting Bull and a massive Native American group of warriors. It does not work out well for Sitting Bull. It does not work out well for General Custer. General Custer and all of his men are killed. Sometimes it's called Custer's The Last Stand. Same battle is also called the Battle of Little Bighorn. This escalates situations very quickly. So Sitting Bull actually realizes after this, and he actually flees to Canada, and we'll get back to him in the lesson today. He flees to Canada. America is furious because now Native Americans have attacked the United States military. How dare they? And now the Civil War is over. We have a large standing army. We need to go deal with this Indian problem is the American mentality. Who do they put in charge? A guy named General William Tecumseh Sherman. So I wanted to use a picture of General Sherman, and I do here in a second. But I feel like you're going to think it's an unfair picture because it just makes him look crazy. So I'm going to show you the pictures I did not use of Sherman. The reason he looks crazy in the picture I want to use is because this is how all his pictures look. Dude's terrifying. In U.S. history, talk about Civil War, absolutely sets everything on fire in the South. Helps with his march to the sea, sets the South on fire, helps bring the Civil War to a close in brutal fashion. He is now in charge of the entire United States military after Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, and he is now tasked with dealing with the Indian problem. So who's in charge of dealing with the Indian problem now? Indian problem in the middle of the country after American soldiers had been killed? Sherman. Now, you're like, if I just use this picture, you're like, that seems a little exaggerated. Probably not. All right, that is exactly what he looked like, and he set a lot of stuff on fire in his march to the sea. So Sherman realizes Native Americans are extremely gifted on horseback. Very hard to catch them on horseback. So the way he is going to defeat the Native Americans is he's going to wipe out their number one resource, the buffalo, which were herds in the middle of the country. Native Americans desperately needed the buffalo. There used to be massive herds of buffalo like this all over the country, all right, or all over the middle of the country. Buffalo are incredibly important to Native Americans because all of Native American life revolves around the buffalo. Every part of the buffalo is used, and is used for something very specific in life, right? So he's got to get rid of the buffalo. So how is Sherman going to get rid of the buffalo? With the Gatling gun. I mean, it gets wild. They're rolling out there on the plains and just mowing down the buffalo. If you can wipe out a whole people's food supply and their entire source of living, you can basically shut down a group of people. Because they couldn't chase them through the middle of the country because Native Americans were so good on horseback, they were faster than any group trying to catch them. So America would just wipe out their food supply. You're like, that's just hard to imagine. How did they? I just can't picture it. Well, here's a picture, which makes it even harder to picture. Those are skulls of buffalo. Wipe out their food supply, wipe out the way people live, almost to extinction. All right? And the only reason they didn't extinct is they probably just couldn't find a few buffalo there at the end. Almost wiped out the entire buffalo population. This picture is just baffling. How many buffalo got killed? So there are still buffalo today. They about got wiped out. Their population is growing naturally now, which is great. But by annihilating their food source, you really do a number on Native Americans at the time. So the question is, after Custer's last stand, what did the American government authorize in order to eliminate Native Americans from causing more issues for expansion? Basically, what did he do to stop Native Americans from being a problem? Answer that, and we're moving on. So, once Native Americans are wiped out, or sorry, not the Native Americans, but the buffalo are, in droves, Native Americans are going to join up and join these reservations because they're going to starve to death if they don't. They're like minimum security prisons. One of the most famous ones is Wounded Knee. That is the name of a reservation. This just adds sadness to the story that is already awful for the Native Americans and their way of life. When they're at Wounded Knee, it's basically a minimum security prison. They can't follow the buffalo. Reservations are useless kind of to the Native Americans in the middle of the country because buffalo don't stay on a reservation. So the Native Americans at Wounded Knee start doing a thing called a ghost dance, which is just a religious dance that they do in their culture, kind of wishing things were the way it was in the past. Just by doing a dance. They have no weapons. All the weapons have been taken from them. The guards at Wounded Knee were freaked out that the Native Americans were doing a dance that they didn't understand. So much so that they opened fire on the Native Americans. It turns into these Native Americans start fighting for their lives because they're being open fired on. They do get weapons that you can see. Some American soldiers get killed here in the Battle of Wounded Knee, or the Massacre at Wounded Knee, because the Native Americans get slaughtered here at Wounded Knee. I mean, it's hard to describe the moral dejection Native American populations have around the country when they realize America won. You were forcing us onto reservations. We're here. We do a religious dance and get slaughtered. The hopelessness that Native Americans feel after Wounded Knee is hard to put into words. It almost feels like you're just waiting to be executed as a people. And there's no silver lining to this. That this is, at Wounded Knee, taking dead bodies to go dump them in a mass grave, an unmarked mass grave of the Native Americans that died at Wounded Knee, that were supposed to be under the care of Americans. So the question here is, describe how the massacre at Wounded Knee, which originated from a cultural misunderstanding of not understanding the ghost dance, is a good example of the lasting issues between European Americans and Native peoples. Like, why is that a good microcosm of the issues that they experience? So pause me, answer that completely, and right before we leave, I wanted to tell you I'd come back to him. Sitting Bull eventually is coaxed out of Canada where he was hiding, and he is killed in 1890. We're going to pick up more of this more present day in our next lesson over or modern society of how Native Americans moving into the 19th century or into the 20th century have handled their experiences in the American society. That's as much as we got today. See you guys tomorrow.